Well, good morning, BridgeWay. It's so good to have you. My name is Kyle. I'm a part of the team here, and we are honored that you are with us again today. Whether you are new or whether you've been here a whole bunch of times, we are truly honored that we can get together and look to the Scriptures and allow God to speak to us. We're going to continue in our series today on 2 Corinthians. It is a letter that Paul writes to the church in a little town called Corinth. Of course, it's not Corinth, it is Corinth. For any of you who are confused about that, there's a city close to Denton. It's called Corinth. Not the same thing as Corinth. Can we at least agree on that? Several of you have said, you're saying that word, that city wrong. They're like, it's Corinth. I'm like, no. It's Corinth. Jesus agrees with me on this. So we're gonna look at chapter 3 today, and again, each week we've been looking at a different topic that Paul is addressing, and this is another one of these issues we're gonna look at this week that really just personally hits me through right between the eyes. What Paul is going to be addressing is another aspect of his relationship with the Corinthian church, and he's specifically going to be talking about a struggle that I think that we all have, or certainly that I have, which is this question of what it is that makes you good enough. The word that Paul is going to use is this word sufficient at the end of our time today. And I was thinking about this week about myself. What is it, if I was being honest, what is it that makes me feel sufficient? And the word sufficient means it means up to the task, it means worthy, it means capable, it means maybe on a deep level, it means what makes you okay. And I think if we're honest with ourselves, a lot of us struggle with that question of what is it on a deep down level that gives us a sense of sufficiency. And so what we often do is we look externally to see how we're doing and to see if we are okay. Because it's easier to look outside of ourselves, right? And this is true. So if you're a parent, the thing that makes you sufficient oftentimes, or these things that I look to make me feel sufficient, is to see how I'm doing as a parent, to see the results that I see in my kids. And so as my kids are obedient, as my kids are succeeding in life and getting good grades in school and being generally nice and making me, let's be honest, look good as a parent, I feel sufficient in that. It gives me a sense that I'm doing okay. In business, we can do this as well. So if you work outside the home, it's very easy for us to look at the results of what we do, a promotion that we get, or a special project that we're assigned to as our way of knowing that we're doing okay. As a pastor, this is something, you would think that maybe pastors don't struggle with this stuff, but I struggle with this feeling of being sufficient. And so what I do is I look to you, I look to our church to help me understand if I am sufficient as a pastor. So what I'll do is I'll look at how many people are attending, and is our attendance growing? I'll look at things like baptisms and metrics and statistics, and I'll ask myself, are we bringing in enough money, and all these questions, because I want to know that I'm doing okay as a pastor. And here's the problem with this. It works great when things are going up and to the right. So when your kids are obeying and doing exactly what they're looking, man, it's a great place to look for sufficiency. When business is going great, when you're getting assigned to the projects and you're just killing your numbers and doing fantastic, it's really easy to find sufficiency. And same thing with being a pastor. I look at our church and I'm like, our attendance is growing, we're baptizing people, we're bringing in money, I'm feeling pretty sufficient. Except for when we have a bad year. Except for when we get laid off from our jobs, or except when I preach a series on money and no one wants to attend, or people are upset. And so our sufficiency goes with how people feel in our external circumstances. And so the problem with this, and what Paul is going to be getting at here today, is that sufficiency is the thing that ultimately determines our identity. And if we're going to kind of give you the big idea of where we're going today, it's this. It's the source of your sufficiency determines the source of your identity. So what we're saying here is that whatever you're looking to, the thing that you're looking to give you a sense of feeling like you are okay, that thing, whatever it might be, will determine where you draw your ultimate sense of identity from. And this is going to be really important for Paul because Paul is going to have to ask himself a very fundamental question. It's, where is Paul going to find his sufficiency? And I think though Paul is, in some senses, like you and I, he is a human, right? He is not divine. But we're going to see here that Paul seems to figure something out here. He seems to have a deep confidence in where his sufficiency comes from, which allows him to persevere when oftentimes people like us, at least me, would oftentimes fail this test because I sometimes want to look to people, to statistics, to the results of my work to know that I'm doing okay. But Paul has something different in mind for us this morning. And so with that, let's begin in chapter 3, verse 1. Let's pick it up here. Paul says, "Are we beginning to praise ourselves again? Are we like others who need to bring you letters of recommendation or who ask you to write such letters on their behalf?" And so Paul begins this conversation, and he's actually addressing here a very common cultural practice. So when Paul talks about praising ourselves, or some, maybe if you're listening or reading from a different translation, it might say boasting. And so we think like, oh, Paul's talking about bragging here, and he's not. What Paul is doing here is he's talking about a very common cultural convention which would happen when you would introduce yourself to someone. So when you would come to a new group of people or a new city or some new context, it would not be out of the norm to sort of praise yourselves or to give sort of an oral resume, a list of your accomplishments or the things that you have done to give you legitimacy to this new group of people. And it wouldn't be considered to be arrogant or rude necessarily. It was just something you did, especially in a formal context. And sometimes if you were really impressive, you would have someone come and actually give this on your behalf, which would be especially cool. And so he's talking about this cultural convention. And then he says, this letter of recommendation. Are we like others who need to bring you letters of recommendation? And these are things that you would bring. Again, if you were coming to a new city, if you were coming to a new church, you might have a letter from someone else who is well known who would basically vouch for you. And so you would give this letter of recommendation to someone, and they'd be like, oh, you know Johnny, or you know James, or you know these other people who we recognize and respect. And so it's a way of presenting yourself to someone. And so when you think about this, though, this is pretty offensive for Paul. Because remember who he is writing to. He is writing to a Corinthian church that he himself founded. And so he says to this question, says, surely not. Paul is basically telling us something important that's happened in this church. Some people in the church in Corinth have asked Paul in a very literal way to reintroduce himself to the church, to provide fresh letters of recommendation so that the church he planted would ultimately accept him. So just imagine this, just to kind of put this into our context here. Let's say your boss came to you tomorrow and said, hey, you know what? We've had a little bit of a rough patch. Things have been a little bit strained here. So what we're going to have you do is we're going to have you re-interview for your position at this company. In addition to this interview, we'd like you to give us fresh letters of recommendation from people that will vouch for you. Could you imagine how you would feel in this context? If you're anything like me, you would be questioning yourself in more ways than one. You would be second-guessing the relationship that you thought you had with your boss and with your coworkers. You'd probably be feeling pretty inadequate. You'd probably feel insecure and self-conscious as you walked in, wondering, are these people that I've been working with for a few years going to accept me? And this is exactly the situation that Paul has found himself in. But we're going to find out that even though this would have been really quite offensive to Paul, Paul doesn't allow this to throw him off track. Paul does not look at this situation and he's not internally crushed, because ultimately what Paul has figured out, and that I think most of us maybe have not, is that this does not all revolve around Paul. Paul is not concerned to the degree that we are about what other people think about him. He has a different motivation, and his sufficiency and what gives him a sense of legitimacy is not what most of us look to. And let's keep reading in verse 2. He says, the only letter of recommendation that we need is you yourselves. Your lives are a letter written in our hearts. Everyone can read it and recognize our good work among you. And so what Paul is doing is he's just calling the Corinthians back to something very obvious that we clearly see that the Corinthians have missed. He says that when it comes to my ministry, he says, you, being the Corinthian church, you are my letter of recommendation. He's the guy who showed up in Corinth. He's the guy who preached the gospel for the first time. These were the first people to come to faith in Christianity in Corinth. And so he's telling them just something very obvious. He says, you, my church, are my letter. You are how God has shown that he has blessed me as an apostle. You're the ones who have shown that my ministry is effective and that the Spirit is at work. And so he's trying to help them understand that the church and that their relationship is evidence, and it is a letter of recommendation. And what Paul's also telling us is that when God is working in us and through us, there will always be some sort of fruit. There will be results. And though it's easy here, and we have to make a subtle clarification, because it's easy for us to say, well, I know I am legitimate because of my ministry results, and that's not what Paul has in mind here. He's got something more basic in mind this. But he is trying to tell us that when God works in us, there will be results. And this has been true for Paul, and it's true for other people. You know, I think about some folks like Peter and Ria Valley, who are doing ministry in Athens, and I think about the fruit of their ministry and the results of their ministry. And just so you know, we've talked about baptism stuff, but each week they are having over 80 people cram into an apartment to do a house church every Sunday in Athens, Greece. Absolutely. It is incredible. It's absolutely incredible to see how God is blessing their ministry. But what Paul is basically saying is, hey, look, you can see what God is doing here. If you're looking for a letter of recommendation, look at yourselves, because when God works in us and through us, there will be results. And we'll talk about this. If you don't have a house church, I realize most of us, myself included, do not have some sort of house church or some sort of maybe official ministry. But the point is, when God works, there will be fruit, even if it's internal spiritual fruit in your life. And then he said, clearly, you are a letter from Christ showing the result of our ministry among you. And so what Paul is doing here is he's getting at the core of the issue. He says that ultimately, my legitimacy does not come from even the church. He says, my legitimacy comes from Jesus himself. And so remember, when Paul's thinking about his ministry, he began ministry because Jesus appeared to him and he chose Paul, then Saul, for a very specific purpose. He says, Saul, you have been persecuting me. I am now going to change your purpose, and you are now going to preach the good news, right? So he has this incredible conversion. So Paul knows Jesus called him to his ministry. Paul knows that Jesus has equipped him for his ministry. Because remember, Paul isn't the guy trying to talk about how awesome he is. He talks about how God, through the Spirit, is working in him and through him and enabling him to do what God has called him to do. And so he ultimately sees what Jesus is doing or what his ministry is doing as a message of what Christ is doing. And so in 1 Corinthians, he actually says this specifically. He says to the Corinthians, he says, Paul, myself, say, I planted the seed when I first came and preached the good news about Jesus. Then he said, Apollos, who was another leader, came back and then he watered it. So Apollos was another leader in this church, and he was responsible for helping to lead and disciple people in this church. But he says, ultimately, it's God who makes things grow. God himself is what creates the spiritual results in our ministry. And so what happens here is Paul is not concerned about the Corinthians' view of him. That's not to say he doesn't care about the Corinthians, but his concern is not his own ego. And let's just be honest, I think sometimes when we struggle with our legitimacy, it's a question of our own egos. We want to know that we, on some way, shape, or form, on our own merits, are sufficient, are up for the task. But Paul doesn't see it that way. He is concerned about how God is working through him, and really his concern for the Corinthians is not how they perceive him, it's how they are responding to the gospel. And which is interesting, because if I thought about my life in those terms, instead of making it all about me and wondering how people view me and perceive me and treat me, and if I was more concerned about how they perceive the gospel and the good news about Jesus and how they respond to that, how might my life, how might your life be different? It says this letter of recommendation is written not with pen and ink, but with the Spirit of the living God. It is carved not on tablets of stone, but on human hearts. And so next week, Paul is going to really develop this whole idea, because Paul knows now that with Jesus with his death and resurrection, Jesus is now entered in or ushered in the age of the Spirit. And so Paul is going to talk about the old law, which is like the Old Testament, the Old Covenant, and he's going to compare that with the New Covenant, which is ultimately marked by the Spirit. And he's actually referencing here, obliquely at least, a passage in Ezekiel. Ezekiel says, I will give you a new heart, I will put a new spirit in you, I will take out your stony, stubborn hearts and give you a tender, responsive heart, or literally a heart of flesh, and I will put my spirit in you so that you will follow my decree and be careful to obey my commands. And so Paul knows that he is a part of making this prophecy come to pass, right? So he knows, he is confident that God is using him in a powerful way, which in a sense gives him a buffer between him and the opinions and feelings of others. Then he says in verse 4, we are confident in all of this because of our great trust in God through Christ. So he's confident in his ministry, not because there are tangible results, which there are. He's not confident in who he is because he has planted a church, which he did. He's not even confident in himself because he saw Jesus. No, he says, my confidence is ultimately in Christ, and that helps him to persevere in the face of other people's opinions, through when he is not experiencing success, at least from an external point of view. And then here's where he gets to the heart of the matter. He says, it's not that we think we are qualified to do anything on our own. He says, our qualification comes from God. And so when he says this, when he says the word qualified, the word actually in the Greek is the word sufficient. He says it's not that we think we are enough on our own. It's not that we think we are worthy on our own merits. He doesn't even think we're up to our task on our own. Then he says our qualification or our sufficiency, the thing that makes us enough and worthy and up to the task that thing comes from God. Verse 6, he has enabled us, and actually that's another word, it's the same word as sufficient, So he has made us sufficient to be ministers of his new covenant. This is a covenant not of written laws, but of the Spirit. And so what Paul is telling us is that he is not confident in his own work. Rather, he is confident in God's work in him. And that is a very, very big difference. He does not think that on his own he has what it takes. He knows this. He knows that he's not worthy, but rather he says, I look to Jesus, who by his Spirit has made me sufficient. He has given me all that I need. He is the one that enables me to do the work that he has called me to do. And so Paul is not concerned with his apparent success. Rather, Paul is concerned with his faithfulness to God and his calling. And these are very, very different concepts. See, for me, I want to be perceived as being a young, successful pastor. I want all of you to perceive me that way. I want you to perceive me as a good parent, as a good father. I want you to look at me and say, Kyle, he is a success. But what Paul is saying, he says, I want you to look at me and see weakness and see brokenness and see Jesus ultimately shine through. And we don't think about things in that terms because, let's be honest, it's easier for me to impress you than it sometimes is for me to impress Jesus. See, I can probably make you think I'm great easier than I can make Jesus think that I'm great. But Paul is more concerned about what Jesus thinks than the Corinthians. Paul is more concerned about how the Corinthians accept and respond to Jesus than they do even his own authority. And that's really, really difficult to do. Your source of sufficiency ultimately determines your source of identity. And though Paul doesn't say the word identity, identity, I think, is the thing behind the thing of this passage. See, when Paul walks through his life and through his ministry, there are lots of moments for Paul to doubt who he is. There's lots of opportunities for Paul to question himself, to question his calling, to question his sufficiency. But the reason why Paul seems to succeed where I at least sometimes fail is that Paul continues not to look at the external results of his work and his ministry. Rather, he continues to look to Jesus. Paul never wavers in his calling. He never wavers in his identity because he knows whose he is. Paul knows who he is because he knows he belongs to Jesus. He is confident in Jesus' death and his resurrection. He is confident that Jesus has placed upon him a authority to go preach the gospel. He knows that he is empowered by the Spirit, and so he never has an identity crisis. When he is shipwrecked, when he is in prison, when he is rejected by a church he planted, if you could imagine, I would probably be questioning who I am at that point in practical terms. And I know I'm not supposed to say that because I know I'm supposed to say I know who's I. But let's be honest. This is the real life here, real world. When people are rejecting you, when you're experiencing at least the appearance of external failure, we tend to doubt who we are, but not Paul. Paul knows that he belongs to Jesus, and so that he knows that everything else that flows from this is ultimately an opportunity to point people back to Jesus and not himself. And when we talk about Christian identity, I think it can be a nebulous topic, right? It really can. We talk about this. If you've been in church any length of time, you've probably heard a pastor come up and say, you need to be confident in your identity in Christ. You need to know who you are. And for me, I think that can start to, it's that thing you hear time and time again, and it starts to lose its meaning. But for Paul, this is the core of what he is trying to address here. He wants the Christians in Corinth to be grounded in their identity in Jesus, because Paul has found that that is the ultimate way that we experience success. So the question here is then how do we do this in practical terms? How do we look to Jesus and make Jesus the source of our identity? And if you would accept my premise that our source of sufficiency determines our source of identity, we actually have to look at the things that we are looking to make us feel okay. First, I want us to do this. We also need to understand our ministry. And this is hard because we look at Paul. At least for me, I look at Paul, I'm like, man, you're an apostle. You're sort of, I know you're not Jesus, but you're like, here's Jesus and here's Paul, and then like we're all way down here. But we have to realize that all of our ministry is the exact same ministry that Paul had. And our ministry does not equal our vocation. I realize it's easy for me as a pastor to get up here and talk about your ministry and things. And you're like, well, that's easy. You go to work every day and you basically get to work on your ministry. But your ministry and my ministry is all the same. Jesus tells us that we're supposed to go into whatever context that he has placed us in. So your home, your school, your workplace, and you're supposed to bring the good news about Jesus into that environment. And you're supposed to help people understand who Jesus is. You're supposed to help them follow him. You're supposed to help people get baptized into the faith. And Jesus, when we do that, promises that he'll be with us. And that is a very bad summation of Matthew 28, by the way. You can read that yourselves. So all of our ministry is the same. And sometimes we forget that our vocation and our ministry are oftentimes not the same. But so if you're a stay-at-home mom, that means your ministry is to bring the good news about Jesus into your home and into your kids and into your spouse and into the people that you interact with. Your job is to help people come and learn about who Jesus is and to follow him in that context. If you work at Starbucks, your job is to bring the gospel into that environment, which means that the really annoying, rude lady who orders that very foofy drink from you is the person you have been called to reach. If you are working in business, that means that's great that you have some sales goals, but your true purpose is to help bring Jesus into that environment and to allow the good news of Jesus to transform every aspect of wherever God has called you. So first of all, that is our ministry. That is our true purpose. And what you happen to be doing as your day job is simply the environment that God has placed you in to bring the gospel into it. So that's the first thing. But then when we talk about looking to Jesus to make us sufficient, again, it's a churchy pastoral thing. So let me just help you to ground this. And I wanted to simply challenge you to ask a very simple question today. And here's the deal. You have to be honest when you answer this question. It won't work if you lie to yourself. You have to ask yourself a very simple question. And first of all, the question is, am I truly relying on God's Spirit in this moment? So what Paul is saying is that the thing that makes him sufficient is God's Spirit living inside of him. So that's the first question. Am I relying on God's Spirit? And then just in very practical terms, would Jesus approve of how I'm doing? As a parent, am I relying on God's Spirit to help me parent, or am I trying to do it on my own? And then, is the way that I am parenting, would Jesus approve of what I'm doing? Not do my friends or my family or my parents or people around me at the airport, do they approve of how I'm parenting? No. Does Jesus approve of what I am doing? In business, you have to ask yourself, am I truly relying on God's Spirit, or am I going to rely on my own effort? And then we'd ask ourselves, would Jesus approve of how I'm structuring this deal? Would Jesus approve of the number of hours I am working? Would Jesus approve of the way that I am conducting myself on the work trip where no one else is around and it's just me and my buddies? Would Jesus approve of the conversation at the water cooler? And I have to ask myself this as a pastor a lot. It is way easier for me to ask myself, will the church approve of me? Will the church be proud of me in this moment? Is the church going to perceive me the right way? Than it is to ask, is Jesus proud of me? And when I think of, and I have to think about this a lot, because there are things when you're put up in a position where I am, and I have to ostensibly speak for God every week, which I don't, by the way. You should go back to the Bible. He already spoke. I just try to do my best. But there are certain moments, certain topics where I'm like, ooh, I think what Jesus would be proud of and what the church wants to hear might be two different things. I think the way I prioritize my family over my ministry, I think those might be two different things. And so, do I want to impress Jesus or do I want to impress you? Am I more concerned about how you perceive me, or am I more concerned about how you perceive and respond to Jesus? And that's challenging. But what I have to look at is when I look to Jesus as the thing that makes me okay, then what happens is my external circumstances, people's opinions, or the results of what I do matter less to me, because ultimately I know whose I am, and therefore I know who I am. And I know when I belong to Jesus, and when I absolutely look to Him as the source of what makes me sufficient, up to the task worthy, then I'm able to live a life that is firmly grounded in my Christian identity, and an identity that comes directly from Jesus. And so if we were honest, if you had to answer the question, if you had to fill in the blank, is blank my source of sufficiency, how would you answer that question? Are your parents the source of your sufficiency? Are the kids your source of sufficiency? Is your money the source of your sufficiency? Is your church the source of your sufficiency? If it is, don't be surprised that that is where you will draw your identity. And when that thing goes away, when that relationship ends, when that money goes away, don't be surprised that if your identity goes along with it. And so when Paul, as he is walking through yet another very challenging chapter with the Corinthians, he is able to remain firmly grounded in the person of Jesus because he looks to Jesus for his sufficiency. And where we look to our sufficiency, or for our sufficiency, is ultimately where we will draw our identity from. And my prayer for myself, my prayer for you, is that we can live a life that is firmly grounded on Christ and His identity rather than the external circumstances, opinions, and success of others. Let's pray this morning.